up on the Whitney Reynolds Show, we're sitting down with a woman who not only predicted her own death, but lives to tell the story. The Whitney Reynolds Show is supported by the Out of Darkness Chicagoland Community Walk, walking to prevent suicide through research, advocacy, prevention, and education. And Volvo, designed around you. Special thanks to the Autobarn Volvo of Oak Park, the Henry George School, 27 Live, and Cobblestone Development. We've all heard the saying, trust your gut, and today's guest is an example of how listening to your intuition can be life-saving. You're watching The Whitney Reynolds Show. Stephanie Arnold, former TV producer turned wife and mom, was pregnant with her second child when she started having nightmare-type visions of her delivery. Not only did these dreams come true, but she died while giving birth. She joins us now with more. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So that package is really died while giving birth. Let's just talk about that. You had visions that you were going to die whenever you were pregnant.
Yeah, so I was 20 weeks pregnant at the time. I'd had a baby before, I had had a C-section before, so it wasn't anything that I wasn't used to. Well, used to, I don't know whether you ever get used to it, right? But at 20 weeks pregnant, I had an ultrasound that showed that I had a placenta previa, which means that the placenta is growing on top of the cervix, but it wasn't abnormal, or it wasn't unusual, so it's a 1 in 200 risk. And as the pregnancy grows, the placenta can move out of the way. But I started getting daily visions, but they were happening anytime throughout the day. At night, I was walking my daughter in a stroller, and I would be seeing a fountain in the middle of February and noticing that the fountain's so beautiful, and in spring when it's all flourishing with water and everything, and that the water was turning to blood. Then all of a sudden, I felt my own body hemorrhage. And every time I would have a different vision, I had visions that I was going to need a hysterectomy. I had a vision that the baby was going to be fine, that organs were going to combine, and that I was ultimately going to die.
You weren't watching any crazy television at this time. You weren't
No.
watching like murder movies, because that's what the first thing I thought about. Like maybe, okay, your subconscious is kicking into what you're watching or what you're hearing. Had you been told horror stories or been watching something that maybe could have led to these visions?
No, I mean, ultimately, I'd had a baby before with no issue complications, except that she was too big. So I gave birth to her at 41 weeks, and that was the only issue that I had. So for me, pregnancy was great, and here it was, my first son, and I was excited to see him and give birth to him. So no, this was something completely different.
So you start having these visions. Did you open up to people about them initially? Because, I mean, how would that be? Hey, honey, how was your day? By the way, I'm picturing I'm dying as I'm giving birth.
So I spoke to everyone. Okay. I tell people that if they sense something, they need to say something. And I was in it. And imagine you're a freight train and you're headed down out of control into a brick wall. I was the only one to see the brick wall. And everybody I would tell, and my husband's a PhD of economics from University of Chicago. He's as linear, statistician as they can get.
By the books.
Yeah, by the books. You know, the doctors were like, what she's afraid of is highly unlikely. I would get ultrasounds, I would get MRIs. I ultimately went to a gynecological oncologist because I said, I'm afraid I'm gonna need a hysterectomy. In fact, I know I'm gonna need a hysterectomy, and I want you to do the procedure if I need it, when I need it. And the doctor's like, have you been on the internet? And I'm like, it's a logical question to ask. I'm like, yes, but this is what I am sure of is going to happen. And he's like, all right, we'll get an MRI, and if I see the organs combining the way that you're describing it, then I'll schedule myself the day of your C-section, a scheduled C-section, and we'll just do the hysterectomy then. And I felt better. So when I had the MRI and the MRI was negative for what I was afraid of, I started to panic. And my husband said, you know what, you should feel better because it's negative. And I said, I don't, because now I'm running out of people to tell my crazy foreboding story to.
So when you were telling people and the doctors were saying, actually, it's not really looking like that, how did you get at least a couple of doctors to pay attention, because that's ultimately,
Sure.
I have this book in my hand, because we're going to get to the book. You wrote a book about your experience, and I'm not even really a reader, and I could not put this book down, because you're wondering, like, is she going to make it? Is she? I remember the first couple of chapters, like, wow, I would almost think, is she crazy? Because here you have these visions, but it was like such a strong intuition that you felt like you had to take action. So how did you get a few doctors to actually pay attention to what you were saying?
Sure. So, at some point, my doctor, Julie Levitt, who's my not my gynecological oncologist, my OB-GYN, was hearing in my voice every single week, this is going to happen. So she said, why don't you have a consultation with anesthesia? Now, I didn't have a consultation with anesthesia before, but for whatever reason, I did this time. And on the phone call, this fellow, her name was Dr. Grace Lim, and she was in her fellowship. And she said something in my voice telling her exactly what I thought was going to happen caused her to flag my file, unbeknownst to me. And she flagged my file and incorporated extra blood and a crash cart in the operating room. And that is in part what saved my life.
That is absolutely, that's one of those moments where you say the intuition really did save your life. And then a woman listening, not only like you listening to your own, but then her listening to it as well, to have the crash cart there.
Yeah, look, I asked her later, I'm like, what was it that made you flag the file? And she said, I had never heard a patient speak so clearly about what was going to happen, had had a baby before, had had a C-section before, and sought out specialists to help save her life. And it didn't stop there. I didn't know that she flagged my file, and so here it is. I'm feeling nobody's listening.
Right. Which is such a frustrating feeling.
Of course. And my husband's like, sweetheart, you need to calm down, and I don't know what to do anymore. And so I started posting on Facebook if anybody had my blood type. I wrote goodbye letters. I sent out goodbye letters. It was the hardest thing about this whole story were those 3 months prior to me giving birth, because I was certain it was the last breaths I was going to take. And nobody could see it happening except for me.
So you wrote goodbye letter. All of this is very fascinating. When you're reading the book, like you really do feel like, wow, is this added for extra drama? But it's really not. Like later on at the end, you talk about the letters and actually going back and your husband seeing that. So you write these letters, you prepare, you say this is like the worst 3 months, but you go into the delivery room. You kind of basically are saying goodbye. What happens the day you go in? Walk us through that.
My husband's in New York at the time that I'm in Chicago, and I start bleeding on the kitchen floor, and I take my daughter and nanny I said, get in the car, let's go drive, and get to the hospital. And I check into labor and delivery, and everything's quiet, and I'm Skype chatting. My husband's now on a plane coming to me, and we're Skype chatting, on the Wi-Fi. And he's like, how's everything going? Everything's fine. And Julie comes in, my doctor comes in and says, everything's quiet in the operating room. Why don't we go? And so what do you say to the person who is the love of your life, and you have an 18-month-old sitting there? And I said, whatever happens, I want you to know that you've made me the happiest woman in the world. And I want you to love our children, and I want you to love this baby that's coming. And he still, at that time, he wasn't believing what I was seeing. So he's like, where do I meet you? And I'm like, 8th floor recovery, hopefully. And then I kiss my daughter a million times, and the doctor says, we're going to be back with your brother and your mother in a little while. And your mother's instinct kicks in, and I want the last images of my daughter, whatever she's going to remember of me, to be happy. And I kiss her, and then we get wheeled out to the operating room. And on the way there, I broke down crying because I was certain that it was the last time I was going to see her. And so on the way to the operating room, I tell my doctor, I'm like, Julie, there's something wrong. You need to put me under general anesthesia. And she said, Stephanie, I don't want to put you under general anesthesia. That'll put the baby to sleep, all these things. But I think you're just nervous. Jonathan's not here. I will be here. And I had an epidural in. I wasn't going anywhere. And sometimes people will say if they're having elective surgery, the doctors won't do the procedure because they're having this feeling of foreboding. So it's like, okay, I'm listening to you. Maybe there's something else going on. But this baby was coming out no matter what.
Right.
So I get wheeled into the operating room, and under the bright lights, Jacob, no problem, is born, no issue, and 3 seconds later, I'm dead.
That's one of those moments. 3 seconds later, you're dead. Now, you're a very spiritual woman, and you actually went back later to find out what happened during your time of death. But
what physically happened?
Yeah. When you say 3 minutes later you were dead, so delivered a healthy baby, and then all of a sudden.
So seconds later, what ended up happening was I ended up having an amniotic fluid embolism, which is a very rare 1 in 40,000 risk. It's basically when amniotic cells get into the mother's bloodstream, and if you happen to be allergic to it, your body goes into somewhat of an anaphylactic shock, and in most cases, women don't make it. So it's got a couple of phases to it. So the very first phase is you go into cardiac arrest, lungs shut down, and if you're a part of a 40% risk that's going to make it to the next level, so I clinically died for 37 seconds. And so that all hell breaks loose, and the doctors go into action. They start, resuscitating me, getting me back up. Second phase of an AFE starts, which is DIC. Now, some doctors, I won't give you the technical term for it, but some doctors have nicknamed it death is coming.
Right.
And what that is your body's inability to clot blood. So that extra blood, and I'm a rare blood type, I'm less than 7% of this entire population, I'm O negative. Wow. So the fact that the operating room had enough blood to hold me, to keep me up, was due to that anesthesiologist that flagged my file.
And Dr. Grace.
Dr. Grace.
Wow. Well, we are going to come back to your story, but now we're going to talk with the doctor that actually helped save your life. We're now joined by Dr. Julie Levitt. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So you were the doctor all through, I guess, the birthing plan, since she came from New York to Chicago.
That's right.
And what did you do when all of a sudden she started telling you about her visions?
Well, we had a plan to handle her delivery, but I was trying to remain calm and take it all in, and I was trying to make her feel better and more reassured. But obviously what she was telling me was very concerning news.
So there was no signs in the initial visits and that kind of stuff that this would all happen. That's one of the things in the book that I was reading is most people probably thought, this is wild, that she's watching too much TV, what's going on? But she would come and she had these thoughts. Have you ever seen a patient like that before?
No, I've certainly had patients that were concerned about their condition or they were worried about having to have surgery, but Stephanie was the first patient I had that came in that said, look, I'm really having these visions and premonitions that something really bad is going to happen and I can't really explain it.
So then the day of the birth, she came in, she was having a little bit of issues, the blood started to come, so she came in, but it was still looking like a normal day for delivery.
Well, she was due to be delivered the following week. And my concern with her bleeding and her cramping was that obviously maybe the pregnancy wasn't going to last another week. And in a physician's mind, you're thinking, keep it safe, plan ahead. By doing bleeding, she was consuming factors in her blood that were allowing her to make blood clots and to keep surgery safe. So my mind was thinking 2 or 3 hours in the future, would she be safe if we waited? We were waiting for Jonathan to get on a plane to return from New York, so obviously that was weighing heavily on my mind.
So then you go in and we go ahead and do the delivery. What happens? What happens with the delivery? All of a sudden she's birthed a child and then she just dies?
Well, the scariest part about what happened to her with the amniotic fluid embolism is that it basically causes a cardiorespiratory arrest. So the heart stops beating, she stops breathing, she basically looks like she's having seizure activity. At that point, we had already delivered the baby and the placenta had been delivered. So we were working to bring her uterus out of her body and repair it in anticipation of putting it back in, which is typical for a C-section delivery. We had started to do that when this had happened and she had the arrest. The anesthesia team and the nurses in the room called for a code and began resuscitating her with CPR. We put her uterus back in and had to wait and just sit quietly so that they could perform the maneuvers to get her heart rate back and to get an airway and put a tube in her airway in order to be able to give her oxygen. So it was a moment where as the surgical team, we had to stand there and almost do nothing for a few seconds until they stabilized her airway and got her heart going again.
At that moment when she coded, was it like, oh my goodness, her visions are coming true?
You know, it took a few moments for me to think about that it was coming full circle. I was thinking, first and foremost, this cannot be happening. And I said that very, very quietly under my breath, looking up at the sky like, this is just unbelievable. Not my friend, not my patient. We've done this before. This shouldn't be happening right now. So I think that it wasn't until we had finished her delivery and stabilized her and we're talking about the ICU that I thought for a moment, my God, she really told us that this was going to happen today. And that's when it became more spooky for me.
Has this changed the way you practice now?
It has, on a number of levels. I mean, I pride myself as a physician who always listened to my patients to begin with, I always tried to be very sympathetic, empathetic, but I think that this has to change you. I mean, I'm so thankful that she's perfect and Jacob is healthy and she's a wonderful mom and enterprising writer and doing all kinds of things. But it's very chilling, and it just is a very big reminder of what I do as a physician doing obstetrics and gynecology every day, but that patients tell you more than you realize when you meet with them, and you really have to listen that much more keenly and not just aim to reassure them if they're frightened, but think deeper into what that really could be and what it means.
Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
We are joined again with Stephanie Arnold. Now, we just talked with your doctor about you dying on the table, coming back. I mean, what a journey. But then what I find fascinating about your book is you want to go back and find out what happened in those moments and why you had the visions and why all this kind of came to life. So it's called Regression Therapy. And how did you find out about this in order to go back and kind of relive the 37 seconds?
So at first, when I was recovering, I went to traditional therapy, and I was finding that it wasn't helping. I would ask therapist after therapist with all the big letters behind their names, how was it I saw everything in great detail months before it happened? And every single one of them said, let's not worry about that right now. Let's just worry about getting you out of the trauma. And I said, see, that's not okay with me, because if I have another premonition or I have something else, I'm going to freeze and not know what to do. So a friend of mine had recommended regression therapy. I'd learned a little bit about it, but almost like past life regression as opposed to just what regression therapy is. And regression therapists use hypnotherapy to take you back into the moments of trauma to help give you a different perspective on the trauma, so that way you can heal differently.
And so the regression therapist worked with you. We're actually going to jump on a Skype with her in just a moment, but she worked with you to kind of go back and relive that. And overall, did that heal the place that needed to be healed?
Absolutely. She took me back to those, and I've done 30 hours of regression therapy, so it didn't happen in the very first instant, but you could see I've been traumatized by it, like anybody that's gone through any kind of traumatic experience. But it started getting less and less and less. And once I was able to get a handle, because I kept asking people, what were you doing during the 6 days I was in a coma? What'd you eat? What did you shop for? What did you buy a dress? Like, I would ask my friends, what were they doing during that time? Because I wanted to feel like it was part of life.
Yeah.
So what this did was it took me back to those moments where I could fill in the gaps.
Having you here on the show, and after reading your book, I mean, it is absolutely fascinating to me. And, I've always said we're a show that likes to talk about things that aren't always talked about. And this is one of them. I mean, dying and coming back to life and then filling in the gaps. This is a first here.
Well, and the thing is when I'm understanding from other near-death experiences and from their books, this is the first that's actually seen it way before it happened. So, and then the ability to give so much documentation around it. So I leave it up to you that is reading it, but this is 100% my experience with the witnesses that saw it throughout the whole time.
That is fascinating. Okay, now we're going to talk with her regression therapist. Let's take a look. Welcome to the show, Linda.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you are Skyping with us from Florida, and you're talking about regression therapy. We just sat down with Stephanie, and she walked us through kind of what that looks like. But what is regression therapy?
Well, regression therapy is one of the many processes we use in psychotherapy that utilizes hypnosis to help us take a person back to an event or a situation that's been traumatic and that is still causing the person problems or symptoms.
When she went back into this, do different types of patients, does it hit them differently? Because we watched a small clip of how it looked with Stephanie, and it looks like she was reliving it. And is that the normal case?
Right. We do have some revivification in certain situations. In hers, we knew where we were going. We knew it was going to be a difficult thing. So there's going to be some emotion there. But what we had her do is look at it in an objective kind of way. Everybody's an individual, so there's different situations, different reactions. But this was very powerful.
Yeah, so when she wanted to go back in, when you're watching that video or whenever you hear about what happened, it kind of seems at times like, okay, is that real? But she was actually able to go in and see where the doctors were standing. And is that normal for regression therapy? Is it normally that detailed?
It depends on the person, but the amazing thing was that she was in an unconscious state, and she still had that in her memory. Typically, when somebody has a near-death experience, they do remember something. They remember a light, a tunnel. She had remembered nothing. So everything was filmed in her head, and it was very powerful stuff. But yeah.
Wow. That is incredible. So when you're working with people in this regression, what are the different levels how long does it take for them to actually get into it? Because via Skype, I know Stephanie did Skyping with you on some of her sessions, and that would seem very hard to connect and get into that zone via the internet. How does that work?
No, not really. The state is very accessible, whether you're with the person on Skype or whether they're here in the office. But each person's different. So we typically help the person learn about what hypnosis is, teach them something so they know what to expect, and then we do a regression. And some people immediately go right to it. And some people need a little more work. It's a very individual thing.
Would you recommend that people that have a near-life experience or a very traumatic experience do this for some type of healing?
Absolutely. Because if you have a traumatic experience, there's going to be some unresolved pain or loss or grief or fear. And if that stuff gets trapped inside you, it doesn't really go away unless you go back and learn to release it or create a catharsis, and then learn to bring a way of reframing that for yourself and create a new understanding and then a healing. It's really a very transformative, restorative type of therapy that really empowers the person. Because when you're in trauma, you're vulnerable, and sometimes you feel very fragile. So in infusing this new ability to help the person, they feel invigorated, strong.
Well, thank you so much for teaching us what regression therapy is and giving us a sneak peek into what you did with Stephanie. It's now time for the viewer's voice, and this week's question is, do you follow your intuition?
Yeah, I do trust my gut, because anytime that I usually it's the right thing that I was supposed to be doing, because when I don't, anytime I second guess myself, it usually, if I would have stuck with my gut the first time, everything would have been great.
I absolutely trust my gut, because it's always right. It's always right. That's the one thing I can definitely count on is my gut.
So we've now gone back in time and we've talked with your regression therapist. That is absolutely fascinating. Where can people, in case they wanted to know more about your story besides just reading the book, do you have a website?
I do. It's stephaniearnold.net, and you can actually log on and see more of the regression therapy.
And we're just folks, we are just getting, we're trying to go as deep as we can, but there's so many layers to this story, and that's what I find fascinating. So you wrote the book, 37 Seconds.
There are things that are happening from it that I would have never had the opportunity. I speak up as a patient advocate and continue to do so, and just tell everybody, if you sense something, say something.
Do you feel that you got a second chance of life?
Yeah, I had no question that I have a second chance of life.
And do you live differently today?
I do live differently. I feel that I am blessed, that our family is blessed, and not a day goes by that I don't, even the littlest of things. I was on kidney dialysis for many weeks, and so I don't take for granted going to the bathroom. I don't take for granted, even if my children are annoying me. I don't take that for granted. Those moments, those breathable moments, those loving moments, I love differently, but I'm much more empathetic than I was before. And in this fast-paced world where people don't have the time to actually get to know one another, I actually sit here and look in your eyes and say, okay, nothing else is happening. Nobody else is over your shoulder. I am having this conversation with you, and whether I see you ever again or whether I see you every day, you and I are going to be connected in that moment.
That's good. That is really good. I think everyone can take that away. And I just want to thank you for coming on, being vulnerable to go back and tell your story. I mean, you wrote a book about it. Sometimes people say, just read the book. That's enough, because every time you do talk about it, you're going back to those moments. So I really appreciate you opening up and opening up all aspects, because, some of it's not always the prettiest, and some of it, you really have to go back and live it. And so thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And what is it again that you say? Go and tell all of our
viewers.
viewers.
I tell everybody to, if you sense something, say something, because it could save your life.
That is so good. So sense it and say it. For more information on today's show, go to WhitneyReynolds.com. The Whitney Reynolds Show is supported by the Out of Darkness Chicagoland Community Walk, walking to prevent suicide through research, advocacy, prevention, and education. And Volvo, designed around you. Special thanks to the Auto Barn Volvo of Oak Park, the Henry George School, 27 Live, and Cobblestone Development.